Hi everyone, welcome to Climate Astrologer Witness YouTube channel. My name is Wanda Harding. I have been studying astrology since 1977. I am also a person who has been studying climate change for the last 15 years. I first heard about it and decided it was really interesting and important information to look into. And I will admit that it was much easier to do so since computers are around with the internet. I can imagine it's a little harder for people years back if you weren't really into using the internet and people didn't always go to the library. If they did, they didn't find the information like automatically. Like I ran across it just by the work that I was doing in an office, and I would see it on various internet channels, and I started to look into it, and I was listening to NPR radio, and that gave me an in and certain things to look up, and that started my study on climate change. The reason that I am combining astrology with climate change is this. So when you're doing a reading for someone, or when you're having a reading done, it is very important to realize and incorporate the fact that we are individuals within a system, in a few systems. We're working within an economic system, a governmental system, and an ecological system. Overall, we have the sociological or cultural system that we function within. So there's many things to take into consideration when sitting with an individual to help them understand their own chart and how everything works together and what the situation is for them within all of those systems. So right now, I would like to start discussing in depth some information that I would like to convey today on top of this. So today's theme is detail versus broad picture. Or do you see the forest or do you see the trees? A tree. I choose this theme today because we are currently in a waxing of the Virgo Pisces moon. And we're right about the time when that's going to be happening right now, when the exact full moon is happening. So I thought this would help us focus on some of the details of our current situation so as to have a broader understanding of the big picture. So where are we right now? We here in the U.S. and the islands of the Bahamas have experienced the Cat 5 Hurricane Dorian. This is the fifth Cat 5 in 4 years, from the information I have found. Also, there have been 35 Cat 5 since the beginning of weather keeping in around the 1880s when the collection began in a serious way. And I'm going to read a little bit from the National Weather Service website. During the early and mid-1800s, weather observation networks began to grow and expand across the United States. Although most basic meteorological instruments had existed for over 100 years, it was the telegraph that was largely responsible for the advancement of operational meteorology during the 19th century. With the advent of telegraph, weather observations from distant points could be rapidly collected, plotted, and analyzed at one location. And that's really important because you're able at that point to consider averages, which is really important in science or statistical considerations. I will start this video off by discussing a very important concept that is very relevant in this day and age: beliefs versus science. So it is true that humans have this innate need to believe in something greater than themselves or in an afterlife. This need has been documented in many cultures throughout history. For instance, July 2011 at the University of Oxford, this is just one study. New research finds that humans have the natural tendency to believe in gods or an afterlife. Research suggests that people across many different cultures instinctively believe that some part of their mind, soul, or spirit lives on after death. The study demonstrates that people are natural dualists, finding it easy to conceive of the separation of the mind and the body. A 3-year international research project directed by 2 academics at the University of Oxford finds that humans have natural tendencies to believe in gods and an afterlife. The multi-million-dollar project, almost $2 million, involved 57 researchers who conducted over 40 separate studies in 20 countries, representing a diverse range of cultures. The studies, both analytical and empirical, conclude that humans are predisposed to believe in gods and an afterlife, and that both theology and atheism are reasoned responses to what is a basic impulse of the human mind. The researchers point out that the project was not setting out to prove the existence of a god or otherwise, but sought to find out whether concepts such as gods and an afterlife appear to be entirely taught or basic expressions of human nature. The Cognitive Religion and Theology Project, led by Dr. Justin Barrett from the Center for Anthropology and Mind at Oxford University, drew on research from a range of disciplines including anthropology, psychology, philosophy, and theology. They directed an international body of researchers conducting studies in 20 different countries that represented both traditionally religious and atheist societies. So we can see here how the search for understanding of the human need for belief in a higher power or is actually universal. Individually, however, everyone goes through their own journey in terms of what they believe. Now, I hope we have established a basis to run on here. So what I am trying to get at is I want to help all who are here to feel comfortable, those who are mostly or even completely scientific, and those who are mostly or completely religious. This may not be possible, but that is what I am trying to do. Bridge this gap. I admit, far more intelligent and learned people have been trying to do this for centuries. I get that, but this is my feeble attempt. It will, of course, take more than this first video discussion to even make a dent, I realize. But I have to start somewhere. Now, where do we go from here? Well, anyone can go on to find other studies about the study of belief in humans. The internet is a huge, massive library in which we can search to find many answers. And it is true, you have to use critical thinking when you're doing so. So it takes practice and it takes, feedback from various sources, comparing and learning. So please take advantage of this to help you grasp the difference between being religious and studying beliefs. Okay, here's another thing that I took here to help explain. Religious studies versus theology. Being two closely related academic disciplines, theology and religious studies are easily confused with each other as both of them have something to do about God. But if you closely consider the scope of the specific subject matter that these two fields touch, then you will realize the difference is far too wide. Religious studies deal with different religious beliefs, institutions, and even behaviors affiliated with religiosity. It is a discipline that encompasses many cultures, enabling it to have a cross-cultural view of religion. It even systematically explains religion and emphasizes varied religious perspectives, taking into consideration its many accounts across history. That's a really important point, okay? Theology, by contrast, differs because it mostly studies about God or the deity. To many, this may even come as a more biased field compared to religious studies that tries to understand different religious beliefs and behaviors apart from a single specific religious view. The reason for such is because theology tends to focus on the Protestant and Roman Catholic sector as opposed to religious studies embracing all world religions possible. As such, religious studies also works hand in hand with other fields like sociology, anthropology, philosophy, history of religion, and psychology. So there's other things. I'm going to put this whole thing that I wrote on so that people can see some of the links that I have on here. Okay. Next. So many here who are from the scientific crowd may be getting impatient as to why I have focused so much on belief so far and not hit on any of the science of climate change yet. Well, I just wanted to establish a foundation for my orientation to astrological beliefs and how that parallels with my study of science and climate change. Hope that covers the question. And also, I want to assist many who are not used to reading and dealing with science on a daily basis, but who are quite oriented towards symbolism. You see, religions or belief systems use a lot of symbolism. So I think that clarifying the difference between how using symbolism and, yes, metaphor to help one understand something like science can be a great importance in communication of complex scientific issues. Okay, so science of climate change. Here we run into how many of those coming here today know and understand anything about the science of climate change. So just in case there are those who do not know what the cause or causes of climate change are, I will read a description of that for you. So I have some graphs and some downloads. Okay, here we go. The atmospheric concentration of CO2 has increased dramatically from a pre-industrial era. We're talking, they say here, 1000 AD, okay? Pre-industrial area, 1000 AD to 1750. The concentration of approximately 280 parts per million to today's 400 parts per million. That is a significant increase. It's scientifically significant, okay? That's done based on scientific analysis, okay? It doesn't mean just a plain old increase. It means it's a significant increase. Scientists warned for years about this dangerous threshold, but with the accelerated pace of emissions, the question changed from whether we would reach CO2 concentrations above 400 parts per million to when we would. Because originally, we had no idea necessarily how fast that would happen. So I'm going to diverge from what I wrote here, and I'm going to discuss the fact that from the very beginning of using fossil fuels, the Industrial Revolution, around 1750, when we were starting to burn coal on a mass scale. Mass scale is a very important concept to understand. Throughout human history, humans have used a little bit of oil, a little bit of coal, very insignificant uses. But when you decide to develop something on a mass scale, it makes a huge difference. So starting with the Industrial Revolution, coal began to be burned significantly more than it ever had. So that was the beginning. Now, so before that, our our atmosphere held around 280 parts per million of CO2. And that's only CO2. There's other greenhouse gases. There's methane, nitrous oxide, okay? Now, as we especially developed our agriculture starting around 10,000 years ago, because before that, we were hunter-gatherers. We didn't have agriculture. We hunted, we gathered in forests and grasslands as we went along. We weren't settled human beings. We roamed, and we gathered our food. That was for around 200,000 years or more before we ever decided to settle and do any kind of agriculture or develop the concept of real ownership of land, etc. So for many, many thousands of years, we existed as in the form we are now, and we managed to be very successful as a species. We started to settle down around 10,000 years ago and develop put seeds in the ground, domesticate animals, and that grew. By around 5,000, 6,000 years ago, we had city-states developing, people lived in cities instead of more rural, and those kinds of situations grew. We had irrigation systems, we had sewer systems, we had governmental systems, and we developed into a very modern species even 5 to 6,000 years ago. But we had been making changes to our environments. There was much in the way of environmental degradation already, but those were regional and local. We hadn't done anything necessarily to affect our atmosphere overall, globally. Now, bring on the Industrial Revolution. Though the amount of carbon in the air up to that point was basically fairly stable, and that's how our agriculture had grown. We had developed growing particular plants that we were using for many hundreds of years and thousands of years. And once we started putting extra CO2 in the air from burning fossil fuels, things began to change. So that 280 parts per million started to grow. Well, that makes a difference because you'd have to go online and look up why greenhouse gases, they're called, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and there's a few others, warm the atmosphere, warm the planet. Partly I'm going to explain some of it. I'm not a scientist, but this is part of it. As the sunlight comes in, heat, generally speaking, it bounces back out. Some of it, or enough of it, had been bouncing back out into space, so that the planet, there was some greenhouse gas effect, which was how we evolved into who we are, what we are, and our agriculture developed through that. But as that greenhouse gas became thicker and thicker, like a blanket, the heat coming in from the sunlight was held in more. We need some greenhouse effect, or we'd be a ball of ice, the whole planet. Yes, we need some greenhouse effect. That's the plus and the positive of our planet. But you can't overdo it. Once you begin overdoing the greenhouse gas and putting more in than what was there when we developed, right now at 413 or 409 parts per million, there's more CO2 in the air right now than has ever been in the atmosphere while humans have lived. So we grew into who we are with a certain amount of CO2 in the air. Now that amount is much, much more, significantly more. And it's not just us. It's our plants and the other animals that we depend on in our ecosystem that has changed drastically. And very, very fast. Generally speaking, when somebody says, well, the planet's changed before, climate's changed before, well, all climate scientists are very aware of that. That's what they study for a living. So they've known this for a very, very long time. But what's really important as far as that goes is how fast the climate changes, or how fast the greenhouse gases were put into the atmosphere. So that brings about a certain speed in the change of climate. In the past, when those changes came about naturally, long sometimes before humans were ever even a drop in the bucket, we weren't even here. We didn't exist. Those changes happened slowly, very slowly. And if they did happen too fast, there were extinctions. You can go online and look up the 5 past mass extinctions. For various reasons, they occurred most of the time. They came about through greenhouse gas changes. So, speed of change makes a huge difference. If it takes thousands of years, it's not so terrible. But what we have done, the massive amount that we've been putting in for just 200 years, is incredible. It has changed the climate so fast, species cannot keep up. Plants and animals cannot keep up. Humans, you might say, well, I can take 100 degrees and I can take 0. What's the difference? It's not about that. It's about averages. And the other part is, remember, we are part of a system. And we depend on many other plants and animals in order to live and exist. And if those plants and animals begin to go away on a mass scale, we're in trouble. And they already have started. You can look up the 6th mass extinction. Okay, there's a lot of information on this. It's a loss of biodiversity. Naturally speaking, before we started monoculture agriculture, growing massive amounts of one kind of plant in a particular area, nature's natural proclivity is to have a lot of variation. You might have, beans, or some kind of bean, wouldn't look like what we have. But there's going to be all kinds of different varieties of that. Same thing for corn. I mean, the original corn didn't look like anything like what we have. I mean, and not to say that a hybrid is so terrible, because our ancestors had developed some hybrids, and that's really not a big deal. That doesn't change things too much. But when you get into changing the genetic makeup of a plant, that's a different story altogether. I'm not going to go into that right now. That might be a topic for another time. But so, let's see where I left off with some of the notes that I have here. So speed of change is extremely significant. Okay. Now, to relate this back to the full moon that we were talking about, Virgo Pisces. Let me just see. Okay. Now, from the astrological website Medium, I found this. I just want to explain a little bit more about the concepts and principles that exist in nature that relate to astrology. See, all we did was take not we, our ancestors, certain concepts and principles in nature and in humans and name it. So this is Virgo. Virgo energy is adaptable to its environment, mutating into the form that it is most suitable for the current situation. Just as any healer has a keen diagnostic eye, Virgo is an analytical energy and has an eye for the finer details. Virgo energy is organized as your biological system, never missing a beat. From, also another site, the Spirit Science Net, thespiritScience.net. It's that analytical left brain way of thinking that can sometimes come off too harsh. Balancing the nurturing and mental female side with the physical, practical, and logical male side of the Virgo sign is crucial. Okay, now, so here I have brought up one way of viewing the world through the Virgo energy. Analytical, using critical thinking. This is the energy we use every day to take care of our duties, responsibilities, and just plain chores. Things that need to be done to live, to survive, to stay alive. A practicality that requires getting past our emotions and biases in order to get her done. Okay, keep that in mind. I'm bringing this up to help people understand the use of analytical thinking and critical thinking. Okay, now, it is necessary to have a clear and analytical mindset in order to understand our environment, okay, on its terms, not according to us, okay? Now, from Astro Library, we're going to go to the other side of that equation to Pisces, the opposite sign of Virgo, the opposite energy. To gain faith and belief in transcendence. Keywords: compassion, universality, intuitiveness, inspiration, renunciation, and sacrifice. Okay, so what's really key there is to gain faith and believe in transcendence. Okay, now the other side of this coin is Pisces. Here we have to go toward the whole picture. Instead of taking it apart, we want to look at the whole. That means we are not using single and separate stimuli or data to come to our conclusions, but seeing how those individual pieces of data work together to create a system, a whole working system. Pisces allows us to see metaphor, symbolism, and what the meaning is behind something. The Pisces energy allows us to understand symbolism and metaphor. So when we view a picture and it tells us a story, we are using our Pisces energy. When we paint a picture, we are using our Pisces energy or having a Pisces experience. It is the ability to make more of all the parts than just adding them up. We use maps to navigate, for example. Of course, these days we use GPS, but when we view a map, it is quite Virgo in its concrete hard copy form. But as we go through the directions in our real life trip, we see how each sign and line is symbolic of the landscape around us. Also, when one hears a fable told, for instance, one can hear the message of the moral in the story. So the metaphor in the story is able to convey an important message that relates to our emotions and helps ingrain that message deeper into our psyche, more so than a parent just telling a child rules or commands of what to do and what not to do. A story tells a deeper, more emotion triggering lesson. So here we are now in the 21st century, trying to decipher our situation. Some who have not gone through the experience of having any extremes of weather so far are still not comprehending our current state of the climate. Others are still saying humans are not that big of a deal on the planet, we cannot cause climate change, our footprint is not that big, or they may be caught in their cultural story of how God created humans to have dominion over the earth and cannot go there to see how we might have affected things, in their acceptance that we caused this state of affairs. Both of these camps will still be thinking in terms of how the earth has always changed before. So what's the big deal? Well, yes, it has changed before. Before man ever arrived on this planet, the earth was changing. But that was brought on by the natural means of volcanic action and many other natural phenomena. There is also this to take, however. Just as deer or any other species can overpopulate due to the loss of natural predators, etc., so can humans overuse, abuse, and overpopulate their habitat. In the past, thousands of years ago, we humans had done so locally and regionally. Here are some examples. So there's a story of Gilgamesh, the ancient Sumerian deforestation. The epic Sumerian tale of Gilgamesh describes vast tracts of cedar forests in what is now southern Iraq. According to the story, Gilgamesh defies the gods by cutting down the forest, and in return the gods say they will curse the land with fire and drought, as described in the ancient tablet seen here. In fact, the Sumerians likely deforested the land, causing widespread desertification. By 2100 BC, soil erosion and salt buildup had devastated agriculture, forcing residents to move north to Babylonia and Assyria. Further evidence for this theory. Some of the first laws ever written to protect forests were decreed in the Sumerian settlement of Ur. So you can Google this more about this. And I remember reading before in the past about this, and they had said that one of the reasons Gilgamesh cut down the forest, the main reason they didn't put it here, is to make his massive navy. He made many ships, especially for that time. It was a lot of ships. So that was one of the reasons they cut down that forest, and in a very fast pace, for as fast as they could go. But he needed a navy, and that's what he did it for. And you could probably find that story online. So remember, the first laws ever written to protect forests were decreed in the Sumerian settlement of Ur. So, why everything matters, even the prairie dog. Here's another example, more modern. There is an old Navajo warning that if you kill off all the prairie dogs, there will be no one to cry for the rain. In fact, the burrowing animals, like prairie dogs, open breathing tubes in the earth. The underground aquifers act like the diaphragm in the human body. The moon, as it passes, raises and lowers the underground water table, and the earth breathes through the many fissures and tubes opened by the burrowing creatures. The exhalation of moisture-laden air filled with negative ions helps create rain. And that's by Stephen Herod Bunner in Sacred Plant Medicine. That's a quote by him. And I put links here again. So here we have a documented occasion of how a belief system, the Navajo, based on real tried and true experience, scientific, helped us grasp the truth about our world. We can begin to see how critical analytical study and determination is important to test and to evaluate any situation. This is shown by the definition of the scientific theory, which actually also relates a bit better to the sign Aquarius. But there it is. Scientific, here, I've put a definition here. Scientific method. The scientific method is a series of steps followed by scientific investigators to answer specific questions about the natural world. It involves making observations, formulating a hypothesis, and conducting scientific experiments. Now we have covered a great deal in regards to the reality of our physical world and how stories and symbolism can show us a bigger picture. Most of the time, balance is required for us to handle our existence. There are times when one side of the equation is more necessary and productive than the other, but eventually, however, that balance needs to be reestablished. So, again, the reason I brought up belief versus science is because in our everyday lives, people have to come to terms with both sides, but many times people don't. Okay, so we are in a habit of living in our current modern industrial society, and we take it for granted much of what we use in our everyday lives. But most of that was based on science. It was invented and developed based on science, and we don't think twice about it. But there's a saying, it's difficult for a man to understand something if his paycheck depends on him not understanding it. So we find it difficult to accept that the culture and the society and our way of life is wrong, that it's detrimental, because that's how we exist, that's how we live. Now, think about that. I'm going to go back to around the 1850s. It was understood then, this is really important, and you can look this up, who discovered that greenhouse gases, CO2 especially, warms the planet. Now, there was some people a scientist or two before this, who had looked into this and had scientific information, but one of the main ones was in 1850s. There was, and I didn't write down the name, but you can look it up. 1850s was the first time it was discovered that CO2 warmed the planet. And so therefore, we've known for a very long time that using fossil fuels, which burn off and exude CO2, would warm the planet. Now, of course, even the scientists at the time didn't realize how fast this would happen. They had talked about it. They tried to cover it in various ways, but everybody still thought it would take a long time, because generally speaking, from historical and scientific data over the next few decades, they'd found that it took a while. It took thousands of years or hundreds of years. But who would know that the economic system that we developed with fossil fuels would turn into this massive, gargantuan, fast-paced, CO2 exuding, monstrous thing so fast? I mean, no, those scientists didn't understand that that would happen so fast. The amount of CO2 that was put into the atmosphere was so fast that it changed things really quickly. By 1950, they knew and understood that there was much more CO2 in the air than they had originally expected, and they put a measuring device on Mauna Loa, the mountain in Hawaii, and they started keeping serious track of what was in the atmosphere. And over time, they realized how fast it was growing even more, and they could see that it was making changes already. So let's cover this. At the end of the 70s and 80s, ExxonMobil themselves asked their scientists to look into seeing if burning fossil fuels by humans was causing climate change. Their own scientists came back and said, yes, it is. And there's many, many documents that Congress has right now to prove that ExxonMobil knew this. But yet what they put into media and their output was, no, humans have nothing to do, fossil fuels have nothing to do with climate change. They did that for a couple decades. By the 90s, they couldn't get away with saying there was no climate change because it was getting very evident. Maybe not to the average person, but to scientists, it was evident. They keep track of this. So then, of course, they kept saying, well, there might be climate change, but it's not caused by us. It's not caused by fossil fuels. But, of course, that was wrong. They lied, and they lied, and they lied. So instead of changing their business model, and instead of the people in government who also knew and understood that this was occurring way back when, nothing changed. We continued to grow our economy based on fossil fuels. Now ask yourself, what brings about more money? Oil and fossil fuel use in a global economy, or building some renewable equipment? And don't get me wrong, that's another whole story. I'm not pushing renewables at this point. I won't go into it right now, but if we'd done something quite a few decades ago, it might have helped. Okay, now, back to ExxonMobil and that scenario. They're being sued by some children in some states, and there's various law cases or lawsuits that you can look up having to do with what Exxon knew. You can look that up. So now let me come back to astrology. I am very concerned about sitting with an individual and say, you know, you're doing their chart and you see that Jupiter's, their progressions, Jupiter's doing really well and is actually might be an older person. Jupiter's now trine their sun. It might have been on a wide orb when they were born, but now it's like exactly trine their sun. And you're like, wow, cool. And their Jupiter transit, you know, they've got a really good Jupiter transit, and they have now maybe their moon's in a good position, progressed wise, and they're having a really good trine from Neptune, and you know, various things in the chart are looking really good. Their solar return looks excellent for this year. And you're sitting there and you're going to tell them, wow, look at all this, you know, great trine from Neptune and all of this, you know, you can use your creative side. And Jupiter's there for you to feel really optimistic for the first time in your life, probably. But they live in Florida. So what are you really going to tell them? You know, it might not be that particular year they're affected by the negatives of the climate weather, but in some way, you're not always going to be able to say when somebody's got really great stuff going on in a chart that everything's going to be hunky-dory. It might be that they have those, but instead of their life being, you know, like you see in some descriptions, life might not be all that fantastic. It might be that the way all that's expressed is that the hurricane that comes and floods their town, they're the one person that happens to be in the right place at the right time and gets saved first versus somebody else. Or it might be that they actually own a boat and they're the ones who are optimistic enough within the situation to go save other people. So this is how we have to address things at this point, because things aren't going to get better. They're going to get worse. I'm not trying to be critical at all of any astrologers. It's just so happens that I ended up, it's the Scorpio in me, I think. I am a 29-degree Scorpio. I have a lot of Sag. So between the two, I really dug a lot. Between studying astrology for so long and then getting into climate change, I really feel it's important. And it's going to take a lot of practice to be able to incorporate how to convey to people the necessary and real connection of astrology in their lives, but within that system that we live. Economic system, ecological system, societal system. It's going to be really important. So I think I should wrap it up today. I hope I made some progress. I hope this was cohesive enough so people could grasp what I'm getting at. I do see that there's some other astrologers discussing this. They might not end up being quite so clear on the climate issues that I'm planning on being. So in the future, we'll have more from me on the situation we face with climate change and more connections to how we can use astrology to help people see that maybe there's not a lot of hope as far as the climate situation goes, but the one reason that I study astrology and the one thing that keeps me going is that I can see how astrology really works. It really works in people's lives. I see it in their personalities. And, again, you have to remember, and astrologers usually know this, you're not making predictions based on the chart. Every good astrologer knows a person's personality and character makes their future. Okay, so this is what we're talking about, and how we can help that person personality-wise deal with what's happening in our real world. So, thank you very much for listening. I hope you really enjoyed this, and I will be back. Thank you for visiting Climate Astrologer Witness today. Bye.